Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander into the dim-lit streets of an empire you think you know, but maybe don't. The Western Roman Empire. Rome with its marble arches, proud generals, and the sort of politics that make modern office drama look like a nap. Imagine stepping into the 2nd century, a world glittering at the height of Roman power. The baths steam, markets chatter in 50 languages, and legions march like clockwork across a continent. You'd think it would last forever, right? But lean a little closer, and you'll hear the creak of beams already under too much weight. The cracks are there, just beneath the frescoes and mosaics. Honestly, if you had to live in it, you probably wouldn't survive long. Too much lead in the pipes, too many taxes, and absolutely no air conditioning. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, leave me a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is on your clock right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the heart of Rome at its dazzling peak, the reign of Emperor Marcus Aurelius still casting a golden glow across the empire. Statues gleam in the afternoon sun. Forums hum with the voices of merchants selling silks from the east and wine from Gaul. And aqueducts snake across the horizon like monumental stone rivers. Rome is the center of everything, or so it wants you to believe. From the cliffs of Britannia to the sands of Egypt, all roads point here. Yet as you move through the streets, past senators in snowy white togas and beggars clutching empty bowls, you sense a faint imbalance. The empire feels like one of those lavish fountains spilling endless water. Beautiful, impressive, but also wasteful, draining constantly from somewhere hidden. And the truth is, Rome's height is also its heaviest burden. To keep the whole machine running, grain must sail in from Africa, taxes must pour in from the provinces, and legions must march endlessly to guard borders thousands of miles long. If you pause by the Tiber, you notice barges stacked with Egyptian grain being unloaded at dawn, carried on tired backs to feed the million mouths inside the city walls. Without it, the restless masses grow dangerous. Romans are accustomed to their bread and circuses. A hungry mob isn't just angry, it's revolutionary. You see, the empire has bought its peace with food and games, an expensive habit that chains it to fragile supply lines. And look at the soldiers returning from the frontier. Some speak Latin with accents so thick it almost feels foreign. These aren't the tidy legions of Caesar's day. Many are recruited from conquered peoples. Strong, yes, but where does their loyalty truly lie? It's as if the empire is patching its armor with borrowed pieces, shiny enough for now, but mismatched. Walking deeper into the city, you catch sight of a villa garden where senators recline, sipping wine so sweet it sticks to the teeth. They talk of philosophy, but really they're whispering about wealth, bribes, and favors. Power here isn't about virtue. It's about surviving in a Senate where knives are as common as scrolls. Already, the Republic's old ideals feel like ghosts that haunt the colonnades. And yet, it is dazzling, isn't it? Rome's illusion works on you too. The marble glows, the temples impress, the statues of gods loom as if eternal. It's easy to be lulled into thinking the empire is a giant carved from stone, unbreakable. But shift your gaze to the shadows, the overcrowded insulae where poor families sleep stacked in wooden tenements that creak with every breeze. A single spark could send the whole block up in flames. For them, Rome is not triumph. It's survival day to day. A historian might tell you that this is the paradox. Rome looks strongest right before it begins to weaken. The prosperity of the 2nd century hides fractures that will later yawn into abysses. It's like staring at a beautiful marble statue already hollowed by worms from the inside. The outside glimmers, but inside, the structure softens, waiting for the right pressure to collapse. And here's a strange little fact to tuck into your pillow tonight. Romans sometimes used powdered crocodile dung as sunscreen. Yes, you heard me right. You can almost imagine a senator smearing it across his chest before stepping into the forum, confident he was both fashionable and protected from the sun. History is nothing if not humbling. You lean against a column, listening to the murmur of the forum. The empire is enormous, too enormous, and it carries its own grandeur like a weight strapped to the shoulders. Already, emperors feel it slipping. They write letters, issue reforms, try to hold the puzzle together. But each piece seems heavier than the last. It's as though the empire is running on a treadmill that only gets faster with time. The mood shifts when you remember this. In less than 3 centuries, all of this, the marble, the Senate, the legions, will shatter in the West. People will walk these streets not as rulers of the world, but as scavengers among ruins. And they will wonder how something so great could fall. You glance once more at the glittering city, breathing in the mix of incense, sweat, and roasting meat drifting through the air. Rome, at its height, has never seemed so alive. Yet you can't shake the sense that you are watching a candle burning brightest just before the wick collapses into smoke. And so, as the lamps flicker to life across the forum, you begin to sense that this journey into Rome's decline isn't going to be about one single disaster. No, what undid this empire was slower, subtler, and more human than that. And you're already standing on the first cracks in the marble floor. You drift from the glow of Rome's heart and feel yourself carried outward, as if you've been placed on one of those endless Roman roads, stone laid on stone, stretching across provinces like veins. The further you travel, the more you begin to understand the staggering size of this world. The empire is a map painted too wide, its borders brushing cold northern seas, hot desert sands, and jagged mountain ridges. From Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the glittering harbors of Alexandria, from the Rhine to the Euphrates, every frontier asks the same question. How long can Rome keep this up? The empire looks majestic on a mosaic, but in person you can hear the strain. March a little in your imagination with a Roman legionnaire, boots caked in mud, carrying gear heavier than your modern suitcase, and you realize the vast distances between posts are not just inconvenient, they're exhausting. A signal fire lit in the forests of Germania might take days or weeks before news even reaches a commander in Italy. By then, it could already be too late. The empire's borders are like thin fabric stretched across a growing frame. One tug, and it begins to tear. And there's the cost. Every border stone you pass whispers of coins spent, grain consumed, roads repaired. Taxes climb higher to pay for legions, fortresses, walls, fleets. Provinces groan under levies of both money and men. You'd almost think the empire is less a ruling power than a hungry beast that feeds on its subjects just to stay alive. One poet of the age even joked that Rome devoured more than it ruled, though he probably said it in Latin, and probably muttered it carefully so the wrong ears didn't hear. You find yourself in North Africa, gazing at endless wheat fields shimmering in the sun. This breadbasket feeds Rome itself, but it also shows the fragility of the system. A storm at sea, a pirate raid, a delayed convoy, and suddenly the million mouths in the capital begin to stir with hunger. Imagine relying on Amazon deliveries every single day for survival, except your warehouse is across the Mediterranean and your delivery drivers are easily bribed or sunk by raiders. That's how precarious Rome's logistics really were. Keep walking and you arrive at the Rhine frontier, a place of misty forests and watchtowers, where Roman soldiers stare into the dark beyond the river, knowing tribes gather there. Sometimes friends, sometimes raiders, sometimes something worse. Here, the empire doesn't feel like marble halls. It feels like a fragile outpost clinging to survival. A soldier's loyalty is tested by distance, cold, and pay that often arrives late, if it arrives at all. And here's a detail that would make modern accountants sweat. The empire often promised more to its soldiers than it could actually deliver. Land, pensions, donatives, lavish promises scrawled onto brittle papyrus. But what happens when the pay chests arrive light, or when an emperor dies before fulfilling his bargain? Soldiers don't shrug it off. They sharpen their swords and pick the next emperor themselves. That's not just a bug in the system, it becomes the system. Back in Rome, senators and emperors issue decrees, convinced they command the world with a wax seal. But out here on the limes, the frontier, it's the local commander who decides whether peace holds or war erupts. The empire is too big for the center to truly control. It's like trying to steer a ship where each oar is rowed by someone who'd rather go in a different direction. And the people themselves, Gauls, Egyptians, Syrians, Numidians, are all called Roman now, at least on paper. Yet being Roman is less about identity and more about paying taxes. Do they feel loyalty to a distant emperor whose face they'll never see? Maybe, but maybe not enough to bleed for him when the barbarians arrive. As you walk this endless empire in your mind, you can almost hear the creaking of the beams again, the strain of size, the weight of ambition. Rome had built a marvel, yes, but one so large it needed constant patching. Each new conquest added glory, but also new borders to defend, new taxes to collect, new mouths to feed. Expansion had once been its strength, but now it feels like an anchor dragging at its chest. There's a strange story whispered among some historians, that in its later years, Rome built more fortifications than temples. That should tell you something about where the empire's mind was, less on celebrating triumphs, more on bracing for storms. And yet, the most unnerving part is that for a long time it still worked. Rome lumbered forward, sweating, staggering, but moving nonetheless. People in the provinces still paid their taxes, still sent their sons to legions, still worshipped under Roman law. To the average person, life went on. Bread baked, wine poured, children played in the dust of villa courtyards. You wouldn't know you were living in a crumbling system until one day, suddenly, the cracks split open beneath your feet. The empire at its height is impressive not only because of what it controlled, but because of how desperately it had to hold it all together. Imagine juggling dozens of flaming torches, each threatening to fall and burn you alive. That's the burden of empire, and Rome was already running out of hands. You follow the road toward a military camp, the smell of smoke and leather heavy in the air. Standards flap in the wind, and rows of tents stretch across the field, neat as chess pieces. Once, Rome's legions were the sharp edge of civilization, disciplined to the point where enemies joked that Romans were less men than machines. In Caesar's time, soldiers were citizens, drilled until they could build a fortress in a day and march 100 miles without complaint. But now, as you step into this later camp, something feels different. Look closely at the faces around the fire. The accents are strange, the hair lighter or darker than you expect. These are men from across the empire, Goths, Syrians, Berbers, Gauls, serving under the eagle. Some fight because they were conquered and forced into service. Others enlisted for the pay or for the promise of Roman land when their contracts ended. They're soldiers of fortune more than sons of Rome. It's practical, sure. Rome needs manpower and the provinces provide it. But loyalty doesn't come in a neat package with the rations. You can almost overhear the hushed conversations. Men wondering whether they fight for Rome or just for their next meal. For some, the empire is not a homeland. It's an employer. And if the employer fails to pay on time, well, there are other armies to join. And here's the funny little irony. Roman generals didn't mind recruiting these outsiders, because often they were tougher than the city-born Italians who had grown soft on wine and theater. A farmer from the Danube frontier knows hardship better than a Roman shopkeeper who's never left the forum. So generals leaned harder on foreigners, and soon whole legions were commanded in Latin but filled with men who spoke it as a second or third language. That doesn't mean they were bad soldiers. In fact, some fought ferociously for Rome, carving their names into history as defenders of the empire. But when times turned bad, when loyalty wavered, you could feel the difference. These weren't the legions of Caesar shouting, "For the Republic!" These were men muttering, "Where's my land grant?" You wander past the smith's tent, where armor clatters and sparks fly. The tools are Roman, the discipline Roman, but the faces around the forge, not so much. One blacksmith hums a tune from his homeland, a melody that doesn't quite fit the cadence of Roman marching songs. The empire is becoming a patchwork army stitched together, durable in some places, fragile in others. And here's a curious detail. Emperors often rewarded whole tribes by settling them inside the empire as foederati, allies bound by treaty. It sounded clever. Give them land, let them defend it, and in return they serve as Rome's shield. But what happens when that shield decides it's tired of protecting you and wants the whole arm instead? A historian once quipped that Rome outsourced its own defense. Imagine if a modern superpower decided to hire rival mercenaries to patrol its borders. It would make sense in the short term, until those mercenaries realized they had the guns and the territory. That's exactly the gamble Rome played. Still, in this campfire light, you can almost forget the danger. The laughter is real, the bonds of comradeship strong. A Syrian archer shares bread with a Gaulish cavalryman. A Gothic spearman hums along with a Roman drummer. In the moment, they're brothers. But you sense that under the surface, Rome's identity is slipping away, diluted like wine with too much water. The army was once the soul of Rome, disciplined, citizen-led, proud. Now it is professional, diverse, sometimes loyal, sometimes not. And when generals see their soldiers as tools instead of brothers, something breaks. A Roman soldier of old would march for Rome because he believed in it. A soldier of fortune marches for coin, and coin alone. You lean back against a tent pole and watch the flames dance in the night. Rome's strength is still here. It can still field armies, still win battles. But in these mercenary faces, in these accents that don't belong to the Tiber, you hear the faint sound of a great machine grinding down. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the glow of the campfires, you can almost imagine another camp. Tribes gathering on the edge of the empire, sharpening their own swords, waiting for the moment when Rome's soldiers of fortune decide they'd rather change employers. Morning comes in your wandering, and you find yourself drawn toward the marble steps of a treasury building. It looks solid, secure, with its bronze doors and carved inscriptions praising emperors who kept Rome eternal. But slip past those doors in your mind and you'll discover the shelves echo with emptiness. The empire's purse is thin, the coins worn down, the wealth already spoken for before it ever arrives. Rome is rich on the surface. Temples gleam, amphitheaters roar with games, but behind the curtain, the government scrambles for cash. Taxes are everywhere. A farmer in Gaul watches his grain measured and carted off to feed distant legions. A shopkeeper in Alexandria feels the pinch as officials demand levies for harbor upkeep, for the fleet, for the garrison. Even burials are taxed. It's as though every breath in the empire costs a coin. You can picture the tax collectors, their wax tablets heavy with names, knocking on doors like unwelcome dinner guests. Pay up or lose your farm. Pay up or see your tools seized. Many peasants simply vanish, slipping into forests or fleeing to estates of powerful landlords who promise protection. Rome thinks it's collecting revenue, but in truth, it's driving away its backbone. The coinage itself tells the story. Once, Roman denarii were pure silver, shining as symbols of stability. Now, as you hold a later coin in your hand, it feels lighter, almost tinny. The silver is shaved away, replaced with cheaper metals. Inflation gnaws quietly at daily life. A loaf of bread that once cost a single coin might cost 20 tomorrow. It's like watching a magic trick in reverse. Money that used to mean something slowly turning into dust. Here's a strange little fact for you to fall asleep on. Some desperate emperors actually issued coins with gold paint brushed over copper, hoping no one would notice. Imagine pulling one out at a market stall, the gold rubbing off in your palm, and pretending you didn't see it. A modern scam email almost feels more honest than that. The military, of course, eats most of the budget. Legions don't march for free. They need weapons, armor, pay, and land grants. And when the army grows restless, emperors pay even more. Extra donatives, bonuses, bribes dressed up as rewards. Every new emperor knows the first rule. Pay the soldiers first or you won't be emperor long. But each payout drains the treasury further, leaving less for roads, aqueducts, defenses, or famine relief. Worse still, the rich don't exactly help. Senators and landowners often found ways around taxes, exploiting exemptions and bribing officials. That left the burden to fall harder on small farmers and merchants, the people least able to bear it. It's like a banquet where the wealthiest guests slip out the back door while the bill is dropped on the poor soul still chewing his crust of bread. As you walk through the treasury halls, you can almost hear the scratching of pens on papyrus, officials recording debts that will never be collected. The empire is drowning in IOUs. Yet out in the forum, life seems normal. Actors perform, gladiators clash, crowds cheer. Rome hides its poverty behind spectacle, like a man wearing fine clothes to conceal that he has nothing left in his cupboards. Historians still argue over just how bad the economy was. Some say Rome kept afloat better than we imagine, that trade routes still thrived and markets buzzed with life. Others point to the endless complaints of ancient writers who saw ruin in every inflated coin. The truth, as always, lies in the middle. Wealth existed, but it was hoarded by the few, leaving the state itself hollow. And you, drifting quietly through this world, feel the irony. Rome conquered gold-rich Spain, fertile Egypt, wealthy Gaul, and yet its treasury runs dry. It's like inheriting a fortune only to burn through it faster than it can be counted. The empire feeds on itself, taxing harder, debasing its currency, squeezing until there's nothing left to squeeze. You step back into the sunlight of the forum. A senator passes by in purple-trimmed robes, his rings gleaming. He looks every bit the picture of prosperity. But you know better now. The marble beneath your feet is cracked, the coffers behind the bronze doors nearly empty. Rome may look like it's built on solid stone, but financially, it's already standing on quicksand. And somewhere, deep down, you sense that when the gold runs out, when the coins lose their weight, the empire itself will lose its gravity. Evening falls, and you wander into a banquet hall glowing with lamplight. Silver platters glisten, goblets overflow with wine sweetened by honey, and the laughter of senators bounces off painted walls. Reclining on couches, draped in silk, Rome's elite raise their glasses to prosperity. Yet outside the door, in narrow alleys and smoky taverns, the poor scrape together crusts of bread, listening to the echoes of that laughter with hunger gnawing at their stomachs. This is the taste of decay, sweet on the tongue for the few, bitter for the many. The contrast feels sharper than a gladiator's blade. Imagine stepping from a villa where peacocks strut across manicured gardens, into a slum where entire families huddle in single rooms. Walls so thin you can hear the neighbor's cough as if it were your own. Rome boasts of marble, but most Romans live in creaking wooden tenements, stacked so high they sway when the wind blows. Fires break out constantly. Smoke stains the skyline like bruises. Inside the banquet, a senator dips a piece of roasted peacock into spice sauce, a delicacy imported at absurd cost. He jokes about the latest games at the Colosseum, where rare animals are butchered for sport. Meanwhile, Children outside chase stray dogs for scraps, their laughter thinner, their ribs sharper. If the empire's wealth were bread, you'd swear someone cut it unevenly, leaving one enormous loaf for the elite and crumbs scattered for everyone else. And here's a detail most don't know. The emperors often staged vomitoriums, not places for the crowd to leave an arena, but literal rooms where the rich could empty their stomachs to make space for more food. The phrase may have been exaggerated over centuries, but the spirit of it lingers. A culture of excess so extreme it becomes grotesque. Imagine pausing a dinner party today just so the guests could reset their stomachs for round two. Not exactly the kind of thing you'd see in a cooking show. But this luxury isn't just indulgence. It's corrosive. The elite retreat into pleasure while the empire crumbles outside their walls. Senators once prided themselves on service, on leading armies, on guiding law. Now they chase luxury, bribery, influence. You overhear whispers not of duty but of how to dodge taxes, how to win favor at court, how to secure another estate in Sicily. Rome's ruling class has grown addicted to its own reflection, blind to the cracks widening beneath its feet. And what of the ordinary Roman? For many, survival depends on the annona, the grain dole. Free bread handed out at the forum isn't charity. It's policy, a bribe to keep the masses quiet. When the grain flows, the people cheer. When it falters, riots erupt. Imagine a city where political stability hangs on whether tomorrow's bread cart shows up. A famine isn't just hunger. It's a spark in a powder keg. The decay seeps deeper. Public morals, once trumpeted as the strength of Rome, are mocked by the very people meant to uphold them. Prostitution flourishes even near temples. Gambling dens echo with shouts. And drunken brawls spill into streets where patricians are carried home unconscious on litters. It's not that Romans invented vice, every society has it, but that they began to wear it proudly like a badge. As you slip back into the banquet hall, wine dripping from jeweled cups, you notice something unsettling. The laughter feels forced. Senators raise toasts louder, as if to drown out the silence that creeps in when the music stops. Perhaps they sense it too, that this is excess at the edge of a cliff, a feast on the night before ruin. Historians still argue whether decadence really doomed Rome, or if it's just an easy story to tell. Maybe the rich weren't much worse than elites in any other age. Maybe. But standing here, watching the contrast sharpen between silk and rags, between fountains of wine and dry mouths in the streets, you can't help but feel that imbalance has weight. And when a system tips too far, gravity always wins. You step outside again, back into the night air of Rome. The alley smells of sweat and ash. The banquet's music is still faintly audible, but here it sounds like something else, not joy but denial. And the people in the shadows don't need a historian to tell them the truth. They live it every day. An empire that devours their labor while feeding someone else's feast. And as you drift onward, the taste of Rome lingers. Not the honeyed wine of the senators, but the bitter bread of those who live on the edge of hunger. The night in Rome stretches on, and your steps lead you past the forums where bronze statues gleam faintly under the torchlight. You notice the stone is chipped, inscriptions weathered. It isn't just time carving away at them, it's the weight of ambition. For beneath those heroic words of conquest and unity lies a political machine so tangled it could strangle itself. You sit on the steps of a basilica, listening. Voices spill through the marble halls where senators once debated law and destiny. But the sound now is thinner, more brittle. No fiery orators calling citizens to virtue, no thunder of statesmen demanding sacrifice. Instead, you hear murmurs about favors, deals, and gold slipped under tables. Senators are less guardians of Rome and more chess pieces in a game played by emperors and generals. Picture a political system where every few years, someone new seizes the purple robe. That's Rome in its later centuries. Emperors chosen not by stability or wisdom, but by whoever could bribe the Praetorian Guard most convincingly. Imagine if modern elections worked like that, except instead of casting ballots, people waved bags of silver at soldiers with swords. Democracy? Hardly. It's a marketplace for crowns. Here's one of those little facts that clings to you. In 193 CE, the Emperor Pertinax was murdered after only 3 months on the throne. What happened next? The Praetorian Guard auctioned off the empire to the highest bidder. Think about that. The very heart of Rome became an item on a shopping list. And the winning bidder, Didius Julianus, lasted just over 2 months before being executed. It's almost comical, if it weren't such a sharp crack in Rome's dignity. You lean back, gazing at the Senate building. Once, it symbolized the collective will of the Roman people. Now, senators are cowed, shadows compared to their ancestors. Real power lies with the army and whoever commands it. And because power means survival, intrigue coils like smoke around every figure of authority. Poisoned chalices, forged letters, sudden betrayals. Rome's palaces are theaters where plots play nightly. The instability bleeds into every corner of life. Governors in distant provinces grow restless, sensing weakness at the center. Legions stationed on the frontier glance at their commanders, wondering if this general might make a better emperor than the puppet back in Rome. And those generals? Many are all too eager to gamble. A few loyal legions, a march toward the capital, and suddenly the empire has a new ruler. The empire becomes a carousel of emperors, spinning faster, each rotation shaking the foundations. Imagine being an ordinary Roman citizen in this chaos. One year you swear loyalty to Emperor A, the next you wake up and realize Emperor B has declared a tyrant. Coins with new faces arrive almost monthly. You can't keep track of whose name you're supposed to cheer in the circus. And the risk of cheering wrong? Ahead on the block. It's as if history itself forgot how to press the pause button. And yet, in the quiet corners, some still cling to the old virtues. Senators write treatises mourning the corruption of their peers. A few emperors try reforms. Diocletian later will attempt to restructure everything with almost obsessive detail. But for now, in the period of rot, Rome's political system is less a spine holding the body upright and more a broken bone that never healed correctly. Historians debate this endlessly. Was it the endless coups and assassinations that drained Rome's strength? Or was it that Rome had simply grown too big, too unwieldy for a single system to manage? Maybe both. The arguments echo like those voices in the Senate, half conviction, half performance. As you rise from the basilica steps, the torches flicker, casting long shadows of stone senators across the forum. You can't help but notice how those statues, though cracked, still stand taller than the men who now shuffle through these halls. Rome once built itself on discipline, on unity. Now it wobbles on bribes and betrayals. You pass a wall with fading graffiti. Someone scrawled a plea long ago, "Give us honest leaders." The paint flakes under your touch. Maybe it was wishful thinking then. Certainly feels like it now. And as the night deepens, you walk on, leaving behind the whispers of corrupt senators and the echo of coins changing hands, drifting toward the next chapter of Rome's unraveling. The road beneath your feet grows uneven as you wander farther from the bright heart of Rome. The torchlight fades, and suddenly you find yourself drifting into the shadows of barracks, where the real pulse of the empire beats. Not in marble forums, but in the clang of swords and the stomp of boots. Rome's soldiers were its backbone. Yet by this stage, that backbone has begun to ache, twist, and splinter. The legions once symbolized loyalty and order. In the early empire, each soldier could march 20 miles in a day, build a camp from scratch, and still be ready for battle at dawn. They were Rome's iron teeth, disciplined enough to chew through almost any enemy. But centuries later, the discipline has softened. You watch as recruits drill with sloppy timing, their shields misaligned, their commanders barking with half-hearted rage. Something's missing, that crackling energy of a force united by cause. What happened? Well, first, Rome relied too heavily on mercenaries. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, emperors recruited entire units from non-Roman peoples. Goths, Franks, even former enemies. Imagine hiring your rival's cousin to guard your front door. Sure, they'll do the job for pay. But if the pay dries up, that cousin might just let your enemies waltz in. Here's a strange little fact. Some mercenaries were promised land inside Roman territory as payment. Not just coins, but farmland, villages, entire estates. Over time, these foreign soldiers weren't guests anymore. They were neighbors. Their loyalty, split at best. Their swords, sometimes turned against the very empire that had once fed them. And the Roman army wasn't cheap. Each emperor had to promise bigger donatives, huge lump sums of gold to keep the troops happy. If he didn't pay up, mutiny. Picture running a modern company where every payday you have to outbid your competitor, or else your employees might assassinate you. That's not sustainable management, it's hostage negotiation. But let's not just blame the soldiers. The geography of the empire itself turned the army into a puzzle. Borders stretched thousands of miles, from the misty forests of Germania to the burning sands of Syria. No matter how many legions Rome stationed, there were always weak spots, and enemies noticed. Huns pressed from the east, Germanic tribes from the north, Persians from the east. It was like plugging holes in a sinking ship. For every leak patched, another sprang open. You sit by a fire outside a barracks, listening to the talk of weary soldiers. They complain about supplies, bread that crumbles, boots that tear too soon. One mutters about missing home, another about the emperor who hasn't paid them in months. These aren't men fighting for glory. They're men fighting to survive, fighting because there's no other trade left to them. And you can feel it, the weariness pressing heavier than their armor. One soldier tells a story of how, in battle, his general fled first, leaving his men behind. Others gnawed bitterly. Leaders once led from the front, but now many prefer safe palaces while their troops bleed. The contract between soldier and state is breaking. Rome doesn't inspire devotion. It demands it like a tired old master. And yet, Rome still tries to boast of its might. Triumphs are staged in the capital, parades with captives and treasures displayed. But if you look closely, you notice some of those captives are not truly conquered, merely pacified for now. Some of those treasures, bought from the very people paraded as enemies. The theater of military glory hides the cracks. Historians argue, was it the reliance on mercenaries that doomed Rome's army? Or was it the corruption at the top that drained the discipline from within? Maybe both, maybe more. But what's clear is that the Roman legions were no longer the invincible wall they had been. They had become, instead, a patchwork quilt, sturdy in places, threadbare in others, and always at risk of unraveling. You rise from the barracks fire, brushing ash from your cloak. In the distance, you hear the hollow ring of a sword dropped on stone, an echo that lingers, as though even the weapons are tired of being raised. The road ahead leads you toward another burden Rome carried, one that grew heavier with each passing year. The endless weight of gold flowing out, faster than it could be gathered. The sound of that dropped sword still echoes in your ears as you follow the road toward the markets, where Rome's other battlefield lies, not on open plains but in ledgers and purses. You step into a dimly lit forum at dusk. Merchants fold away their stalls, scales creak as coins clink, and the air smells faintly of olive oil gone rancid. This is where you begin to sense that Rome's economy, once a roaring furnace, has begun sputtering into embers. For centuries, wealth flowed into the empire like rivers of silver and gold. Conquered lands paid tribute, caravans brought exotic goods, and the spoils of war filled Rome's coffers. But with conquest slowing, that flow reversed. Rome spent more than it earned, armies to pay, borders to defend, palaces to gild. You see it in the faces of tax collectors, pale and strained, as they squeeze every last denarius from weary farmers. Taxes became unbearable. Imagine trying to grow wheat, only to find soldiers at your door demanding most of your harvest. Many farmers gave up entirely, abandoning land to seek work in cities or to join bandits. Whole estates lay fallow, fields choked with weeds where once golden grain swayed. You picture a Roman accountant scratching his head, wondering why tax revenue shrinks even as tax rates soar. It's the same problem you'd find today if a government tried taxing you for simply breathing. Eventually, people stopped cooperating. Then there was inflation. Coins that once rang bright with solid silver were slowly debased. Emperors desperate for quick funds mixed in cheaper metals. A shiny coin might look the same at first glance, but its value whispered of fraud. By the late empire, soldiers sneered when paid in copper-heavy coins, merchants demanded higher prices, and trust dissolved. It's like if you paid for your morning coffee with monopoly money. Technically it's currency-shaped, but no barista is falling for that. Trade routes, once secure under Roman might, now faltered. Pirates lurked in the Mediterranean, raiders prowled along land roads, and caravans arrived thinner and poorer each year. Grain shipments from Egypt, vital for feeding Rome's teeming masses, were interrupted. Bread shortages sparked riots, bread doles drained treasuries, and the city that once lived on conquest now staggered under its own hunger. Here's an odd little fact. Some estates in Italy became so unprofitable that landowners begged to give them away, just to escape the crushing taxes. Imagine being so weighed down by a house mortgage that you beg a stranger, "Please, take my villa. I'll even throw in the olive trees." But nobody wanted them. That's how toxic the burden of taxation became. And in the cities, luxury flaunted itself while poverty gnawed. Senators draped themselves in silk imported from the East, even as common people begged for stale bread. Gold leaked constantly, toward Persia in tribute, toward merchants for luxuries, toward mercenaries for protection. Rome wasn't producing enough of its own wealth. It was bleeding out into the world beyond. You pause at a workshop where a smith hammers weakly at a lump of metal. He shrugs when you ask about business. "The army takes most of it," he mutters. "And when they can't pay, they promise credit. But I can't eat promises." His eyes are ringed with fatigue, and you sense the quiet despair of a man trapped in a cycle too large to escape. The economy wasn't just faltering. It was eroding trust. Farmers distrusted tax collectors, soldiers distrusted paymasters, merchants distrusted coins, citizens distrusted bread supplies. The whole system, once lubricated by confidence in Rome's power, creaked and groaned like a cart whose wheels are about to fall off. Historians still argue whether the economy truly collapsed or merely transformed, sliding from a bustling market empire into a patchwork of localized survival. But for the people living it, the smith, the farmer, the hungry child clutching at a crumb of bread, it felt like collapse. Each day brought less certainty, less stability, less hope. You walk away from the market as the night thickens, carrying with you the hollow clink of debased coins. Behind you, stalls stand empty, their canopies flapping in the wind like broken sails. Ahead, another shadow beckons. Politics. Because if Rome's economy was fragile, its leadership was even worse. Like a ship with too many captains, all drunk on power and none steering straight. You follow the road away from the silent market, and almost immediately you stumble into the noise of shouting voices. Politics, Rome's favorite blood sport. Picture a tavern brawl, but instead of broken bottles and bar stools, imagine senators waving scrolls and daggers with equal enthusiasm. The empire was once guided by seasoned hands, but now it feels like a carousel of emperors spinning so fast you can't keep track of who's in charge. Leadership became a revolving door. In 1 century alone, more than 20 emperors rose and fell, some reigning for only months. Many of them weren't overthrown by foreign enemies, but by their own generals, their own guards. You see it in your mind. A man crowned with laurel in the morning, stabbed in a tent by nightfall, forgotten by breakfast. If you ever feel like your workplace has high turnover, imagine HR trying to update Rome's imperial roster every other week. The Praetorian Guard, once protectors of the emperor, turned into kingmakers, or more accurately, auctioneers. At one notorious point, they literally sold the throne to the highest bidder. Imagine that, the title of Emperor of Rome going to the guy with the fattest wallet, like buying a used car, except the warranty expires when the next ambitious general shows up with a bigger sword. Civil wars tore across the empire. Generals raised armies against each other, each convinced he had a divine right, or at least enough muscle to claim the throne. Soldiers followed not out of loyalty to Rome, but loyalty to pay. And if pay faltered, loyalty crumbled. You picture legions marching not to defend the borders, but to sack their own cities, chasing power like hungry wolves snapping at scraps. Here's a strange truth. Some emperors tried to hide in religion or ceremony, cloaking themselves in divine titles. One styled himself as a living god, another as the earthly representative of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. But behind all the pomp, their grip on reality and the empire was fragile. The Senate, meanwhile, was reduced to little more than a decorative prop, nodding along while real power slipped into military camps. And then there's the paranoia. Emperors saw conspiracies everywhere. You hear whispers in dark corridors, poison in the wine, daggers in the shadows. Many emperors trusted no one, killing allies, brothers, even wives. Imagine living in a palace so drenched in suspicion that every cup of water tasted like betrayal. A ruler who fears his friends more than his enemies cannot rule for long. One lesser-known tidbit. At one point, there were 3 rival emperors at once, each claiming to be the true ruler. Picture a medieval group chat where everyone argues, "I'm the admin now." The empire fractured under the weight of competing egos, and the people, ordinary farmers, merchants, and soldiers, suffered the chaos. Historians still debate, was the real cause of collapse the economy or the endless political infighting? Maybe both, because when leadership is unstable, even strong institutions wobble. And when those institutions wobble, the economy collapses faster, feeding the cycle. It's like trying to balance on a seesaw while someone keeps jumping up and down on the other end. As you walk through a crumbling forum, you notice old statues defaced, emperors' names scratched out, replaced by the next man's. History rewritten in stone, over and over, until the people must have wondered, who's even in charge? Does Rome itself still matter? Or is it just a prize in a perpetual Game of Thrones? The voices of those squabbling senators fade as you step back into the cool night air. The city's torchlight flickers, shadows stretching long. Ahead, you hear the faint sound of chanting, the rise of something new, something un-Roman, that will both divide and redefine the empire. Religion whispers on the wind, promising salvation but also sowing fresh divisions. You follow the sound of those chants deeper into the night, and soon you realize you're no longer standing in a forum or a palace hall, but in a dimly lit underground chamber. The air smells of damp stone and oil lamps. You see small groups huddled together, whispering prayers to a new god, Christianity. a faith that had once been outlawed, mocked, and persecuted, but now was beginning to wrap itself around the empire like ivy crawling over a crumbling wall. At first, Christians were an easy target. They refused to burn incense to the emperor, which, in Rome's eyes, looked less like religious freedom and more like treason. You can almost hear a governor shouting, "What do you mean you won't light the incense? It's just symbolic." But to the faithful, those little rituals meant denying their God. So persecution followed, martyrs in arenas, saints in chains. And yet, strangely, the more Rome cracked down, the more the religion spread. You know that rebellious friend who insists on listening to the most obscure bands until they suddenly become mainstream? That's Christianity in Rome. The underground act that accidentally went viral. Then came Constantine, the emperor who flipped the script. In a dream, he claimed to see a cross in the sky with the words, "By this sign, conquer." He took it as divine endorsement. Soon after, he not only legalized Christianity but poured imperial resources into it, building churches, granting privileges to bishops, and weaving faith into the empire's fabric. Suddenly, the religion that had been whispered in catacombs was now preached in grand basilicas. Talk about going from zero to state-sponsored in record time. But here's the twist. While Christianity unified some, it also divided others. Pagan temples that had stood for centuries were closed, sometimes violently. Ancient rituals, festivals, and even cherished local gods were swept aside. Imagine if your neighborhood shut down all coffee shops overnight and replaced them with juice bars. You'd have riots too. Many Romans clung to the old gods, whispering that abandoning Jupiter and Mars would doom the empire. And in their defense, the timing didn't look great. The empire was collapsing just as Christianity rose. Coincidence? The historians still argue. One lesser-known detail is how many sects within Christianity fought each other just as fiercely as they fought pagans. Was Christ divine? Was he mortal? Both? Neither? Councils were convened. Bishops shouted across tables. Sometimes even fists flew. You picture one of those church meetings turning into a scene like a modern reality show reunion special, except with togas instead of sequins. Over time, bishops gained more power than senators, their words shaping laws, their disputes shaping politics. Religion became both a refuge and a battlefield. You can almost feel the tension. One neighbor carving a cross on his door, another secretly lighting incense to old gods, each suspicious of the other. The empire's unity frayed, not just along political and military lines, but along lines of belief. And here's a curious fact. Some emperors tried to straddle both worlds. Julian, later nicknamed the Apostate, tried to revive pagan traditions after Constantine's embrace of Christianity. He brought back sacrifices, restored temples, and mocked the new religion. But his reign was short, and his efforts fizzled. Christianity had already sunk its roots too deep. The old gods were fading whether Romans liked it or not. As you listen to the chanting in that underground chamber, you notice how steady the rhythm is, like the hum of a lullaby against the chaos of politics. For ordinary people, Christianity wasn't about imperial decrees or councils. It was about hope, that suffering had meaning, that death wasn't the end. In a world where emperors rose and fell like leaves in a storm, that kind of stability was irresistible. Historians still debate whether Christianity weakened Rome, draining resources, discouraging traditional civic duty, or whether it actually saved what little unity remained, carrying a cultural torch long after Rome's political light went out. Either way, the shift was seismic. Rome was no longer just an empire of roads, aqueducts, and legions. It was now the seat of a faith that would outlive the empire itself. You step out of the underground chamber, the chants fading behind you. Above, the night sky seems vaster, the stars sharper, And yet, you sense a new kind of fracture in the empire, not one caused by swords, but by beliefs. Ahead, a chill wind carries the smell of campfires. Barbarians are gathering, restless, waiting for Rome's weakness to reveal itself. You hear that wind carrying the smell of campfires, and suddenly you're not in a quiet Roman alley anymore. You're at the edges of the empire, staring across a river at shadows moving just beyond the torchlight. On the far bank, men gather in clusters, their spears upright, their voices humming in guttural songs that don't sound like Latin at all. These are the so-called barbarians, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, and Huns. Rome thought it could tame them with treaties, gold, and a show of legions. But history whispers that those flickering campfires will one day burn inside the empire itself. The Romans called everyone outside their walls barbarians, a word that basically meant you sound funny when you talk. To Roman ears, foreign languages were just bar. And yes, that's literally how the insult stuck. You might laugh at the arrogance, but the truth was the so-called barbarians weren't just wild forest people grunting around campfires. Many of them farmed, traded, and even served in Rome's own armies. You can almost picture a Roman officer squinting at his roster and realizing half his Roman soldiers are named Alaric or Clodio. Awkward. The pressure on Rome's borders wasn't new, but by the 4th century, it was intensifying. The Huns, nomadic horsemen sweeping in from the steppes, pushed other tribes westward like dominoes falling. Imagine a crowded subway car when a wave of passengers surges in. You're shoved whether you like it or not. The Goths, desperate for safety, begged to cross into Roman territory. The empire, stretched thin and short on food, reluctantly agreed. But once those masses of hungry, restless families were inside, it was like inviting an entire marching band into your living room and telling them to just keep it down. Spoiler, they didn't. Here's the strange detail. Rome had often relied on barbarians as allies or federati. They were paid in gold or land to guard borders, fight wars, and do the empire's dirty work. For a while, it worked. Cheap labor and extra soldiers, what could go wrong? Well, imagine hiring security guards who slowly realize they outnumber you and maybe don't like your rules. Yeah, that's what went wrong. In 378, this fragile relationship exploded at the Battle of Adrianople. The Goths, tired of mistreatment and starvation, rose up. The Roman Emperor Valens, overconfident, marched against them without waiting for reinforcements. You can almost hear the smugness in his voice. They're just barbarians. How hard can it be? Famous last words. The Goths crushed the Roman army. Valens himself burned alive on the battlefield, and the illusion of Roman invincibility shattered. Historians still call Adrianople one of the worst defeats in Roman history, proof that the empire's borders were no longer walls, but doorways. What's often forgotten is how quickly the Goths adapted. They learned Roman battle tactics, wore Roman armor, even demanded to negotiate with emperors as equals. Rome was no longer dealing with ragtag outsiders. It was facing mirror images of itself, armed with its own playbook. And those whispers you hear from across the river, they're not going away. They're multiplying. Of course, Romans had their spin on things. They liked to imagine themselves as the civilized center and everyone else as wild and chaotic. But here's a little-known truth. Many barbarians looked at Rome with awe. They wanted its luxuries, its titles, its marble villas. Some leaders even dreamed of ruling Rome, not destroying it. And that ambition was perhaps the most dangerous force of all. You stand on that riverbank, the moonlight catching on the restless water. Behind you, the empire feels heavy with religion, bureaucracy, and taxes. Ahead of you, the campfires flicker with restless energy, songs echoing like thunder rolling closer. You realize the fall of the empire won't come from a single sword stroke. It'll come from the relentless weight of neighbors pressing in, testing the walls until they crack. Somewhere in the dark, a horse whinnies. The shadows shift. The barbarians aren't waiting forever. The campfires fade, and you feel yourself drawn into the night where the whispers of the Goths grow louder. They are no longer just shadows on the horizon. They are at the gates, restless, hungry, and tired of being treated like animals in Rome's pasture. This is the moment when outsiders stop knocking politely and start demanding a seat at the imperial table. You see them first as refugees, families trudging south, children barefoot, wagons rattling with the meager possessions of entire tribes. In 376, tens of thousands of Visigoths, pressed hard by the advancing Huns, begged to cross the Danube into Roman territory. They didn't come with war cries. They came with open hands, asking for food and land. Rome, weary but pragmatic, said yes. After all, hadn't barbarians always been absorbed into the empire, becoming soldiers, farmers, even senators? But this time, something was different. Roman officials, greedy and corrupt, saw opportunity in desperation. They sold food at impossible prices. Some sources claim they even sold dog meat to starving Goths. Imagine that humiliation, chewing on scraps in the shadow of Rome's granaries. The bitterness festered like a wound. You can almost hear it in the silence of those long refugee camps, the grinding of teeth, the whispers of betrayal carried through tents at night. By 378, the pot boiled over. The Visigoths rose in revolt, and the empire responded with its usual arrogance. Steel, legions, and an emperor who thought his crown made him invincible. Emperor Valens marched out to meet the Goths near Adrianople. He didn't wait for reinforcements, eager to grab the glory for himself. It was a summer day, blazing hot, the kind that bakes armor until it burns your skin. Picture yourself in that line of Roman soldiers, sweat stinging your eyes, shield heavy on your arm, and the faint sound of thunder rolling from the distance. Not weather, but thousands of horses. The Gothic cavalry struck like a storm. They swept around the Roman lines, crashing into the flanks with brutal force. The legions broke apart, discipline crumbling in the chaos. Valens himself disappeared in the frenzy. Some say he was struck down by an arrow. Others that he burned alive when he took refuge in a farmhouse set ablaze. No one ever found his body. The Emperor of Rome, consumed in the dust and fire of a battlefield he thought he could command. Adrianople wasn't just a defeat. It was a revelation. Rome could bleed, Rome could lose, Rome could crumble under the weight of outsiders it once mocked. Ancient historians whispered that 2/3 of the Roman army were destroyed that day. Imagine the shock. The empire's mighty legions, once invincible, shattered by those they had called barbarians. But here's the twist. The Visigoths didn't march straight on Rome. They didn't even have the means to. They weren't conquerors yet. They were survivors. Instead of toppling the empire, they negotiated. They demanded land, status, recognition. The Romans, forced to bow, gave them what they wanted. For the first time, a barbarian people lived inside the empire as a distinct, semi-independent community, not as conquered subjects but as partners by necessity. It was as if the walls of the empire had been breached not by siege engines, but by paperwork. The Goths became Rome's uneasy houseguests. They served in armies, walked Roman streets, traded in Roman markets. Yet the resentment never vanished. They remembered the dog meat. They remembered the arrogance. And above all, they remembered Adrianople, the day they proved Rome could fall. Historians still argue about Adrianople. Was it the beginning of the end? Or just one more setback in a long, battered history? But as you stand in that field of bones, hearing the wind whistle through broken helmets, you can't shake the feeling that something fundamental shifted. Rome's enemies were no longer at the borders. They were inside, and they weren't leaving. Somewhere in the distance, a Gothic chieftain raises his hand to the sky. His people cheer. You realize the future doesn't belong to emperors in purple robes anymore. It belongs to men in furs and iron, speaking in tongues Rome once mocked, carrying memories sharper than any sword. The night air cools, but the memory of Adrianople lingers like smoke. You keep walking, following the echo of boots and the crackle of campfires. And then, in a blink, the air thickens, heavy with the scent of burning wood and oil. You hear bells, distant shouts, and suddenly you realize you're not standing in a field anymore. You're inside Rome itself, the eternal city, and it is burning. It is the year 410, and the Visigoths have come back, no longer refugees begging for bread, but warriors taking what they believe they're owed. Their leader is Alaric, a man born in the shadow of Rome, trained in its ways, yet forever denied true belonging. Imagine growing up at the edge of greatness, watching your people bleed for an empire that never welcomed them. That was Alaric. He had marched with Roman legions, fought their wars, even been promised high commands. But Rome never trusted him. And now, here he stood at its gates, not as a servant but as a conqueror. You see the gates of the city swing open. Was it betrayal? Was it hunger gnawing at the guards? Some whispered that slaves or sympathizers quietly unbarred the doors. However it happened, once inside, the Goths flooded the streets like water through broken stone. For 3 long days, the eternal city was theirs. Picture it. Senators clutching their togas, jewels glittering uselessly in their hands as warriors smash down their doors. Statues topple. Silk curtains are torn to shreds. Gold and silver, once paraded in triumphal processions, are loaded onto carts bound for Gothic camps. Even sacred treasures vanish, the spoils of 1,000 Roman victories reversed in a single night. And yet, here's the strange truth. This sack was not the orgy of blood and fire later poets imagined. Alaric's men were restrained compared to what history could have been. Churches were spared. Priests shielded their flocks under the banner of sanctity. Many houses were untouched, but the symbolism, that was uncontainable. Rome, the heart of the empire, the city no enemy had entered in 800 years, now humbled by the very people it once despised. You walk through those streets and hear the wailing, the disbelief. To Romans, this wasn't just a raid. It was the end of the world. Saint Jerome, writing in Bethlehem, cried out, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Can you imagine the chill running down spines from Britain to Syria? If Rome itself could fall, what was safe? What was eternal anymore? But Alaric wasn't trying to destroy Rome. That's the odd part. He wanted recognition, land, a permanent home for his people within the empire's borders. The sack was less a conquest and more a bargaining chip. Yet before negotiations could settle, fate struck. Just months after the sack, Alaric died suddenly, some say of fever. Legend claims he was buried beneath a diverted river. The waters turned aside to cover his grave, with every slave who helped in the work executed to preserve the secret. His body sleeps somewhere in Italy still, perhaps under flowing waters, his story hidden by the current. The Goths would wander further, eventually settling in Gaul and Spain, building kingdoms on Rome's soil. But the scar of 410 never faded. To live in the Roman world after that year was to live with the knowledge that the unthinkable had happened, that even the mightiest walls could be breached. Historians argue even now, was the sack of Rome truly catastrophic or mostly symbolic? Economically, Rome had long since shifted its weight to other cities like Ravenna, Constantinople, Milan. But emotionally, spiritually, this was a dagger in the heart. The eternal city had been humbled, and as you drift down those smoke-filled streets, hearing the cries fade into the hush of night, you can't help but wonder, if Rome itself can burn, what hope does the empire have left? You step away from the glowing ruins of Rome, the sound of weeping still clinging to your ears like ash. The streets fade, and in their place, you hear a different kind of silence. The emptiness of fields left unplowed, markets gone quiet, coins jangling in too light purses. If fire destroyed Rome's pride, economics quietly hollowed its bones. The Roman economy once stretched like a golden thread across the world. Grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, spices from the East, silver mined from Spain. Picture long caravans of oxen dragging carts down dusty roads, sails on the Mediterranean glittering like teeth under the sun. That was Rome at its height, an empire where wealth flowed in one direction, toward the capital. But by the late empire, that golden thread frayed. You feel it when you step into a market stall now. The shopkeeper's hands tremble as he weighs a coin, biting it to test if it's real silver. Too often, it isn't. Roman emperors, desperate to pay soldiers and bribe officials, shaved the silver out of coins. Denarii that once shone bright were reduced to dull scraps, worthless alloys stamped with emperors' faces nobody respected anymore. Inflation followed like a bad hangover. Bread cost more than families could manage. People hoarded goods instead of selling them. Trust, the invisible glue of markets, melted away. And then there was the taxation. Heavy, relentless, suffocating. If you owned land, you were shackled by the tax collector. Soldiers didn't just come for coin. They'd take cattle, grain, even your children to serve in the army if you couldn't pay. The wealthy found loopholes, bribing their way free, while ordinary farmers bore the crushing weight. Some abandoned their land entirely, slipping away into forests to join bandits or rebel groups. Others fled into the arms of great estates, offering their freedom in exchange for protection. Sound familiar? That's the seed of medieval serfdom sprouting centuries early. People binding themselves to lords because the empire no longer shielded them. You wander down a Roman road, at least what's left of one. Weeds poke through the cracks, milestones lie toppled, and caravans are rare. Trade itself has thinned. Pirates prowl the seas, roads crumble without repair, and local self-sufficiency replaces the wide networks that once made Rome powerful. Cities shrink. Populations drain back to the countryside, where survival is easier than relying on markets that no longer function. One curious truth: some emperors tried bizarre economic fixes. Price controls were imposed, decrees threatening death to merchants who charged too much. Of course, instead of stabilizing things, that drove trade underground. Diocletian even once issued an edict on maximum prices, trying to fix the cost of everything from wheat to a lion for the circus. It collapsed almost instantly. Imagine your boss deciding how much Netflix, a burger, and a car should all cost and expecting it to work. Spoiler, it didn't. And yet, here's the haunting part. You can still feel the grandeur beneath the ruin. Roman aqueducts still flow, baths still steam, markets still buzz faintly. But the cracks are obvious. When money means less, when food costs more, when loyalty can be bought but not maintained, society starts to rot from the inside. Historians still argue. Was it inflation that truly broke Rome? Was it the tax burden driving peasants into despair? Or was the deeper problem that Rome never adapted from conquest wealth to a stable, balanced economy? Conquest stopped, but expenses never did. Armies still had to be paid, walls still had to be built, emperors still demanded luxury. Without new provinces to loot, the empire slowly starved itself. You hear the echo of coins dropping into an empty jar. The sound repeats, fading into the night, as if the empire itself is counting its last pennies. and you realize empires don't always collapse in fire. Sometimes they just run out of change. You keep walking, but the clink of worthless coins doesn't fade. It morphs into whispers. They swirl like cigarette smoke in a dim corridor. Murmurs of bribes passed under tables. Plots woven in candlelight, daggers glinting behind smiles. Politics in late Rome wasn't the noble senate you might picture with marble benches and orators in spotless togas. By now, it was a theater of shadows, a place where corruption became not the exception but the bloodstream. Imagine, for a moment, you're a senator. Once, your role was to debate law, govern provinces, guide the emperor. But here, in the dying centuries, your main job is survival. Power doesn't come from wisdom anymore, but from scheming, paying, and betraying faster than the man next to you. Bribes grease every decision. Governors buy their offices, then squeeze provinces dry to earn back the cost. Tax collectors skim off the top. Even judges are for sale, their verdicts awarded to whoever pays more, not whoever is right. And the emperors? Oh, their thrones were built on corruption. Soldiers demanded donatives, bribes really before swearing loyalty. An emperor might promise gold to the army when crowned, but if he couldn't deliver, the legions would happily sell the purple robes to someone else. The Praetorian Guard, the supposed protectors of the throne, became notorious auctioneers of power. In one infamous case, after the Emperor Pertinax was killed, the Guard literally sold the empire to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus won by promising mountains of gold. He lasted all of 9 weeks. You sit down in this imagined Senate chamber, but the air is rancid. Deals are cut openly. Public funds are siphoned into private estates. Corruption eats away at morale too. Why should a soldier fight loyally if his paymaster steals his wages? Why should a farmer keep working land when he knows the officials will cheat him blind? The empire becomes not a community but a marketplace of greed. And there's another side effect, you can feel it like a draft through a broken window. Loyalty to Rome weakens. Instead of serving the state, people serve themselves, their families, their patrons. The empire becomes patchwork. Local governors acting like little kings. Soldiers loyal to generals rather than to Rome. Senatorial families plotting for their clan's advantage, not the empire's. The great Roman ideal, that sense of being part of something eternal, collapses under petty ambitions. A strange truth lurks here, almost too modern. Corruption didn't just rot Rome's politics. It created chaos in leadership. You've already seen how emperors rose and fell like leaves in a storm. But behind each rise and fall were backroom deals. Assassinations approved with a wink. Senators whispering promises they'd never keep. Rome's government became less about ruling and more about surviving the endless knife fight of ambition. Some historians still puzzle over this. Was corruption a cause of Rome's fall, or simply a symptom of it? Was the system already too vast, too strained, so that bribery was the only way to make things function? Or did corruption itself grind the empire down, draining resources, eroding faith, turning every official into a parasite feeding on a weakening host? Either way, you can feel it in the walls of the Senate chamber. Marble cracking, voices bitter, the air heavy with smoke and suspicion. The empire no longer leads. It deceives, bargains, and barters. And in this carnival of corruption, no one notices the shadows lengthening outside the gates. The whispers fade, and now you hear footsteps. Hesitant, uneven, like men pacing a marble floor but unsure which door to choose. That's the sound of leadership in late Rome. Weak, wavering, and too often clueless. You picture the imperial palace, halls stretching endlessly, mosaic floors glimmering with images of gods and heroes. Once, an emperor here could command the world with a gesture. Augustus, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, they were rulers with vision, discipline, and the gravitas to hold an empire together. But by the later centuries, you're more likely to find emperors who are pawns, soldiers of fortune, or children thrust into power by scheming regents. The problem wasn't just bad luck. Rome's system had become unstable, and leadership turned into a revolving door. Generals marched on Rome, declared themselves emperors, only to be toppled by the next ambitious commander. Some emperors ruled for decades, yes, but far too many reigned for months or even days. You might call it Rome's version of political speed dating, except instead of awkward small talk, there were assassination plots and coups. And then there were the puppet emperors. Picture a teenage boy, still too young to shave, suddenly wrapped in purple robes because his mother or uncle thought they could rule through him. Some emperors were literally crowned as children. Valentinian III was 6 years old when he became emperor in the West. Honorius, one of the most notorious weak rulers, was about 10 when he took the throne. He grew up obsessed with his pet chickens, famously caring more for them than for the crumbling empire. When told Rome had perished, he supposedly thought someone meant his favorite hen, which he had named Roma. You almost laugh, but it's tragic too. How could the empire survive when its fate rested in the hands of the incompetent or the disinterested? Weak emperors leaned on court officials, eunuchs, and generals who often had their own agendas. This created constant power struggles behind the throne. One moment, an ambitious general was protector of the realm. The next, he was branded a traitor and executed, only for another general to take his place. And weak leadership didn't just mean poor decisions, it meant paralysis. When crises struck, emperors hesitated, gave conflicting orders, or fled. During barbarian invasions, some emperors preferred to hide behind walls instead of rallying their troops. Others trusted bad advice, handing crucial provinces to corrupt governors or relying on mercenaries with little loyalty. Imagine being a soldier under such rulers. You're stationed on a freezing frontier, your pay delayed, your armor rusting, and your emperor back in Rome more worried about palace intrigue than your survival. Or imagine being a farmer in Gaul, hearing that raiders are approaching, but your leaders are too busy bickering over ceremonial titles to organize defense. Weak leadership wasn't abstract, it was a daily wound for ordinary Romans. And here's a strange truth. Sometimes, Rome's survival depended not on its emperors, but on strong generals or local leaders who stepped in. Figures like Stilicho or Aetius fought valiantly to hold the empire together, often in spite of the emperors they served. But their loyalty was always in doubt. An emperor might praise them one year, then execute them the next, fearing they'd seize the throne. Rome devoured its best defenders one by one. Historians still debate. Was it weak leadership that doomed Rome? Or was the empire already so fractured that even a Marcus Aurelius reborn couldn't have saved it? Either way, you can feel it now, those hesitant footsteps, the echoes of rulers who should have stood tall but instead faltered, leaving Rome adrift. And while emperors stumbled, other forces gathered strength. Outside the empire, tribes and kingdoms waited, watching for their chance. Inside, the economy groaned, corruption spread, and the people lost faith. Weak leadership wasn't just a flaw, it was an open invitation for the storm to break through the walls. You hear the clatter of metal rusted, worn, not the proud shine of legionary armor from Rome's golden age. The sound is off, like soldiers practicing drills but out of rhythm, each step uncertain. That's the decline of Rome's military echoing back at you. You remember when legions were the stuff of nightmares, organized, disciplined, professional. They could march 20 miles, build a fortified camp, and still be ready to fight before dinner. They were Rome's hammer, and the world bent beneath their strikes. But by the later centuries, those legions had become something else entirely. Smaller, weaker, less Roman in every sense of the word. Why? For one thing, money, or rather, the lack of it. Recruiting and equipping soldiers had always been expensive, and as the empire's economy faltered, it became harder to pay troops. Salaries were delayed, equipment was outdated, and promises of land or bonuses often went unfulfilled. Imagine trying to motivate an army with exposure and eternal glory instead of actual food or coins. Not exactly a winning HR strategy. Another problem was manpower. Rome had stretched itself thin, and as population numbers dropped, plagues, famines, wars, you name it, the empire simply couldn't raise enough citizens to fill the legions. So they turned increasingly to outsiders. Germanic mercenaries, Gothic federates, even entire tribes were recruited to fight under Roman banners. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it was like inviting the fox to guard the chicken coop. These non-Roman recruits weren't necessarily disloyal at first. Many fought bravely for pay and Roman prestige. But when push came to shove, who were they truly loyal to, Rome or their own people waiting just beyond the frontier? More than once, mercenary forces switched sides in the middle of a conflict or demanded more pay under threat of desertion. The famed Roman discipline began to crumble as the legions became patchworks of hired hands, lacking the iron training of old. And discipline was everything. Early Roman soldiers trained endlessly, drilled to move as one body, to obey orders without hesitation. Later armies, they had less time, fewer resources, and lower expectations. Drills became sloppy, morale dipped, and desertion rates skyrocketed. The once mighty Roman war machine sputtered like a neglected engine. Then there were the generals. Some were competent, heroic even, but too many were ambitious politicians more interested in carving out power than defending Rome. Armies were marched against rival Romans as often as they were against external threats. Civil wars drained resources and shattered unity, leaving frontiers vulnerable. When legions fought legions, who protected the borders? You can almost see it. A Roman frontier fort, once bustling with hardened veterans, now manned by half-trained recruits and underpaid mercenaries. The walls are cracked, the armory half-stocked. The banner still flies, but with fading colors. A Gothic raiding party approaches, and instead of charging with the old ferocity, the garrison hesitates, calculates, maybe even bargains. That hesitation was fatal. And yet, here's the twist. Rome still had moments of brilliance. Commanders like Aetius, nicknamed the last of the Romans, won remarkable victories even with weakened armies. At the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451, he held back Attila the Hun, a feat so unlikely it felt like the empire's dying gasp of glory. But those were exceptions, not the rule. Historians still argue about it. Was the decline of Rome's military because of mercenaries? Or because of civil wars? Or simply because no state can sustain such a massive army forever? The answer is probably all of the above. What you do know is this. By the time the Western Empire faced its final enemies, its armies were shadows of the legions that once thundered across Europe. The sound of clashing steel grows faint now, more like scraps of iron tossed in the dirt than the roar of an unstoppable force. You realize you're not hearing Rome's army anymore. You're hearing its ghost. The ghost of marching boots fades into another sound. Quills scratching on parchment, coins sliding across a desk, whispers behind closed doors. This is the sound of corruption, subtle but just as deadly as any barbarian spear. You picture Rome not as a gleaming marble city, but as a sprawling bureaucracy drowning in paperwork, bribes, and favoritism. By the later centuries, the empire's administration was enormous, complicated, and, let's be honest, deeply corrupt. Officials skimmed off taxes, governors treated provinces like personal estates, and justice often depended less on law and more on who could slip the most gold into the right hand. You can imagine it vividly. a farmer trudging into town to pay his taxes. The collector leans back in his chair, smirks, and adds an extra fee. That money doesn't go to the empire, it goes straight into his pocket. Multiply that by thousands of officials across the empire, and suddenly Rome's treasure chest looks a lot emptier than it should. And when funds meant for defense, infrastructure, or grain distribution vanished, the cracks in the empire widened. But corruption wasn't just about money. It was also about power. Positions in the government and military were often sold or handed out as favors. Competence became secondary to connections. Imagine running an empire like a corporate office where promotions depend on who brings the boss the nicest wine rather than who can actually manage a province. Doesn't take long for things to unravel. And speaking of wine, senators, nobles, and wealthy elites often lived lives of indulgence while the average Roman citizen scraped by. Banquets with exotic foods and fountains of wine stood in stark contrast to the hunger in the streets. The empire began to feel like two separate worlds, one of decadent privilege, the other of grinding poverty. That divide poisoned trust. Why sacrifice for an empire that only seemed to enrich the few? Then there was decay of values, or at least that's how Roman writers described it. Moralists like Ammianus Marcellinus ranted about how Romans in the capital obsessed over theater, gambling, and luxury, while neglecting the virtues that had once built the empire. It's easy to imagine an old senator shaking his head at the youth of his day, complaining that nobody wanted to farm, fight, or serve anymore. Whether exaggerated or not, the perception of decay itself mattered. People stopped believing Rome was worth the struggle. There's a stranger detail that always lingers in my mind: petty fraud at the tiniest levels. For example, bakers mixing chalk into flour to save money, builders cutting corners with cheap mortar, contractors charging for marble but delivering plaster. It seems so small, but multiply that dishonesty across an empire, and trust erodes everywhere. A culture of corruption eats at the foundations of society until even honest citizens feel foolish for playing fair. And you can't help but smile at the irony. Rome had once prided itself on law and order, the empire of the 12 tables, of courts and legions enforcing discipline. But by the end, even the judges were bribed, and laws became tools for the powerful rather than shields for the weak. Justice was technically blind, yes, but it could still feel the weight of a coin in its palm. Historians still debate how much corruption caused the fall. Was Rome uniquely corrupt, or just as corrupt as any big state, only unlucky in timing? Some argue that corruption wasn't fatal on its own, but combined with economic troubles, invasions, and weak leadership, it became a poison in the empire's veins. As you lean back, the whispers of bribes and betrayals still echo in your ear. Rome didn't just collapse because of enemies outside the walls, it rotted slowly from within. And sometimes, it wasn't the crash of a barbarian sword that ended things. It was the quiet sound of a coin sliding across a desk, sealing yet another dishonest deal. The whispers of corruption fade into the low chant of hymns, carried on the air like incense. You hear it in your imagination, voices rising softly in unison, the sound of something both gentle and powerful. Christianity had begun as a small, persecuted movement, huddling in secret catacombs, but by the late Empire, it was no longer on the margins. It was marching straight into the heart of Roman power. At first, you can picture the empire's leaders scratching their heads. This strange religion, one God instead of many, an insistence that all souls were equal before him, clashed with the traditional Roman worldview. For centuries, emperors had leaned on the old gods to unify the people. Jupiter, Mars, Venus, divine patrons who made Rome special. But when Constantine legalized Christianity in the early 4th century, everything began to change. Soon, pagan temples fell silent, and crosses began to rise. Imagine the confusion for ordinary Romans. One year, you're pouring wine to Jupiter at a family altar. A few decades later, your children are told to kneel before a carpenter from Judea. For some, it was inspiring, a new faith that offered hope beyond the crumbling world. For others, it felt like betrayal. What about the old gods who had supposedly built the empire? Had Rome abandoned them, or had the gods abandoned Rome? Christianity also redirected the empire's focus. Earlier Romans had glorified civic duty, military valor, and loyalty to the state. Christianity, though, placed its highest value on spiritual salvation. Why die for Rome's borders if eternal paradise was elsewhere? Why give everything to the empire when your true allegiance was to God's kingdom? That shift didn't destroy Rome single-handedly, but it did alter the culture's heartbeat. There's a curious detail here. Bishops became as powerful as generals. While emperors struggled to hold the frontiers, bishops in cities like Rome, Milan, and Carthage organized charity, mediated disputes, and even negotiated with invaders. To many citizens, the church began to feel more reliable than the empire itself. When the state faltered, the church fed the hungry, sheltered the poor, and preached hope. And with that came a subtle power shift. Gold that might once have funded legions instead built basilicas. Think of it. Soldiers going unpaid while massive churches rose with glittering mosaics. You can't help but imagine a grizzled legionary staring at the gilded ceilings, muttering about how those tiles won't stop a barbarian spear. Historians still debate this. Some say Christianity weakened Rome by diverting loyalty from the state, encouraging pacifism, and fostering divisions between Christians and pagans. Others argue it was Rome's salvation, providing a unifying faith as everything else fell apart. After all, the church didn't collapse with the empire, it carried much of its memory into the Middle Ages. There's also a little-known twist. Not all emperors agreed on Christianity's role. Julian the Apostate, for instance, tried to bring back paganism in the 360s. He reintroduced sacrifices, reopened temples, and mocked the Christians. But his reign was short, and after his death, Christianity came roaring back. The attempt to rewind the clock failed. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity wasn't just tolerated. It was the empire's official religion. And so, as Rome staggered, Christianity offered both comfort and controversy. It inspired some citizens to endure hardship with new faith, while others grumbled that the abandonment of the old gods had cursed the empire. Even now, historians argue over whether Christianity was a cause of decline or a torch that lit the path through the dark. The hymns still echo faintly, blending with the distant clash of swords is coming again. Rome's fate wasn't decided by religion alone, but faith had rewoven the empire's identity. And when the final curtain fell, it was Christian monks and priests who carried the last fragments of Roman memory forward into the long night of the Middle Ages. You feel the empire stretching in your mind's eye, like a sheet pulled too tight across a massive bed frame, cracking here, sagging there. Rome had always been vast, but by the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, it was almost ungovernable. Think of trying to run a global corporation with no internet, no phones, not even reliable roads in half the territories. Messages moved as fast as a horse could gallop or a sailboat could catch wind. For an empire that sprawled from Britain's damp marshes to Egypt's golden deserts, that slowness was lethal. So came the great experiment: divide to survive. Diocletian, the emperor with a knack for bold decisions, split the empire into eastern and western halves at the turn of the 4th century. His logic was sound. One man couldn't possibly defend such vast borders, so he created co-emperors. Think of it like installing 2 CEOs to manage a failing company. But of course, shared leadership usually works about as well in politics as sharing fries with a hungry toddler. Messy, tense, and full of suspicion. The East was wealthy, centered on cities like Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria. It had strong trade routes, fertile lands, and walls that gleamed with marble. The West, meanwhile, inherited Gaul, Spain, Britain, and Italy. These lands had glory, sure, but their economies were weaker, their cities less fortified, and their frontiers under constant barbarian pressure. It was like giving one sibling the family mansion and the other the drafty old farmhouse. At first, the system seemed to work. The Eastern emperors handled threats in the Balkans and the Near East, while the Western rulers struggled with Gaul and Germania. But cracks soon showed. Resources flowed eastward, leaving the West starving for tax revenue and soldiers. Citizens in Italy might have felt like they were carrying the burden while their cousins in Constantinople hoarded the silver. Sound familiar? Even today, regions complain about who pays more in taxes versus who benefits. Some things never change. What's fascinating and not widely remembered is that the division wasn't meant to be permanent. Diocletian thought the halves would still act like one empire, two faces of the same coin. But human ambition doesn't like neat designs. Rivalries grew, borders between East and West hardened, and soon enough, unity was only a memory whispered in marble halls. By the late 4th and 5th centuries, the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, as we now call it, was thriving compared to its Western counterpart. The East had silk from China, spices from India, and endless ships moving through the Bosphorus. The West had crumbling roads, vanishing farms, and soldiers who sometimes went unpaid. When barbarians pressed on the Rhine or Danube, the Eastern emperors sent just enough help to keep the West limping along, but never enough to fix its deeper wounds. Imagine yourself as a Roman living in Ravenna, the Western capital in the 5th century. You hear rumors of Constantinople's glittering palaces, walls too strong for any barbarian to crack, and markets overflowing with goods. Meanwhile, your own streets are quiet, your granaries half empty, and your army filled with Germanic mercenaries you're not sure you can trust. Wouldn't you feel abandoned? Wouldn't you wonder if the empire still existed, or if you were living in its ghost? Historians often note this division as one of Rome's turning points. A single, united empire might have weathered the storms better, pooling its resources against common threats. But divided, the West was left vulnerable, exposed like an unarmored flank in battle. Some argue that the East deliberately let the West die, choosing survival over solidarity. Others insist it wasn't a choice, it was simply impossible to save both halves. And so, the empire that had once marched under one eagle standard now fluttered with two. East and West, rich and poor, enduring and collapsing. The Roman world had split, and though people still called it one empire, the seams were already tearing. The candlelight in your mind flickers lower now, casting long shadows across broken maps. You realize this division wasn't just political, it was the beginning of two destinies. One half would fall into ruin, while the other endured for another 1,000 years. But for the Western Empire, the clock was ticking faster than anyone wanted to admit. You hear the drumbeat of hooves echoing across the damp forests of Germania. The sound doesn't belong to legionaries, steady and trained. It's heavier, rougher, like thunder made of bone and leather. Rome had always lived with barbarians at its borders, tribes like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks. But in the 4th and 5th centuries, those tribes stopped being occasional raiders and started becoming full-scale invaders. The empire's walls no longer felt like walls. They felt like thin curtains fluttering in the wind. Picture yourself standing on the banks of the Rhine in winter. Ice breaks against the gray water, and across the river you see campfires glowing in the cold mist. The firelight reflects on spear tips and shields carved with strange patterns. You hear the deep chants of warriors preparing themselves, not for a raid, but for migration. They're not just coming to fight. They're bringing wives, children, carts piled with furs and livestock. It's not an army, it's a people on the move. And that's what made the situation so dangerous. The Goths were among the first to push hardest. Fleeing from the terrifying advance of the Huns in the late 4th century, they begged for asylum inside Roman lands. Rome let them in, but poorly managed the influx. Thousands of hungry, desperate people crammed into refugee camps with little food. When mistreatment turned to open revolt, the Goths unleashed their fury, culminating in the Battle of Adrianople in 378. A Roman emperor, Valens, was killed on the field that day. A shocking moment, like watching the captain of a ship vanish beneath the waves while the storm rages on. And the Vandals? They wandered across Gaul and Spain, finally sweeping into North Africa. Imagine losing Rome's breadbasket, the fertile farmlands of Carthage, the place that had fed Italians for centuries. Gone just like that. Rome wasn't simply fighting battles anymore. It was losing its dinner. The Vandals didn't just conquer. They turned into pirates, raiding the Mediterranean, threatening trade routes that once glittered with grain and olive oil. Then came the Huns, the horse archer storm from the east. Led by Attila, their name alone sent shivers down Roman spines. Imagine thousands of riders, their ponies kicking up dust, arrows hissing through the sky like a swarm of bees. Attila demanded tribute, and Rome often paid huge amounts of gold just to keep the Hun scourge away. Paying your enemies not to attack you. It's not exactly the sign of an empire in its prime. But here's the strange truth. The barbarians didn't always want to destroy Rome. Many of them admired it. They wanted land, citizenship, a piece of the wealth they'd heard whispered about in their own villages. Some of their kings wore Roman titles, minted Roman-style coins, even spoke Latin. It was less like Rome versus the barbarians, and more like Rome being swallowed by them. Absorbed, reshaped, transformed. Still, for ordinary Romans like you, the invasions felt like the end of the world. Imagine living in a small villa in Gaul. One day, smoke rises on the horizon. You hear rumors that the Vandals have crossed the river. Do you pack your things and flee to the nearest walled city? Do you trust that the local garrison will protect you? Or do you pray, clutching your children, while hoping the invaders pass by? These are the choices millions faced as the Western Empire bled from its borders. Historians debate endlessly. Were these invasions truly foreign attacks, or were they simply migrations gone violent? Some argue that Rome collapsed because it couldn't integrate these peoples fast enough. Others insist it was inevitable. No empire can survive when surrounded by so many hungry, ambitious neighbors. But for you, walking along that dirt road as hooves rumble in the distance, such debates mean little. All you feel is fear, and the sense that the empire that once seemed eternal is crumbling around you. And yet, somewhere deep inside, you can't help but marvel at it. The Goths, Vandals, and Huns were not faceless villains. They were people seeking survival just as you would. The fall of Rome wasn't a clean story of heroes and villains. It was chaos, migration, and desperation, swirling together until no one could tell who was Roman and who was barbarian anymore. The wind picks up in your imagination now, carrying with it the clash of swords and the crackle of burning villages. You know the invasions will only get worse. The Western Empire is now fighting battles it cannot afford, losing land it cannot replace, and watching as its borders dissolve into shadows. The coins in your hand feel lighter than they should, not just because of their weight, but because of what they mean. For centuries, Roman currency was the backbone of trade, an assurance of value stamped with the emperor's face. But by the late empire, you'd notice something strange when buying bread at the market. The silver coins looked duller, thinner, sometimes more bronze than silver. Inflation had begun its slow, suffocating crawl, and the Roman economy was starting to collapse from within. You shuffle into a bustling market in a city like Trier or Ravenna. The air smells of garlic, wool, and stale sweat. A baker slaps a loaf onto the counter, demanding 10 coins for what used to cost 2. People grumble, mutter, argue. Some refuse to sell their grain at all, hoarding it instead of trading for worthless money. A farmer might shrug at your offer of denarii and demand livestock in return. Your goat for his bushel of wheat. Coins no longer buy security, they buy suspicion. Rome's problem began when emperors, desperate to fund endless wars, diluted the currency. Fewer precious metals, more cheap filler. It's like pouring water into wine. You still get drunk, but the taste isn't the same, and soon no one trusts what's in their cup. The government printed promises, but promises don't feed armies. And armies are expensive when your empire stretches from the Atlantic to the Danube. Picture soldiers on the frontier demanding their pay. They run their fingers over their wages and laugh bitterly. They know these coins won't buy much. Some desert, others extort the locals. You see Roman discipline, the iron backbone of the legions, beginning to melt like wax under heat. Loyalty comes not from patriotism, but from whether or not the next payday can actually fill a stomach. Taxes, too, grew unbearable. The empire's bureaucracy dug deep into the pockets of peasants and landowners alike. If you lived in the countryside, you might dread the tax collector more than the barbarians. He arrived not with swords, but with ledgers, demanding a portion of your harvest, even if your family was already hungry. Miss a payment and your property might be seized, or worse, your children bound to the land forever as serfs. Freedom drained away coin by coin. And here's an odd detail. Some cities resorted to paying their officials with goods instead of money. A governor might be compensated with sacks of grain, jars of olive oil, or even cloaks. Rome's mighty system, once proud of its commerce, was reverting to barter like a village market. It's a bit like if your modern paycheck suddenly arrived in frozen pizzas and secondhand sneakers. You'd survive, but you wouldn't exactly feel confident about the economy. The wealthy, as always, found loopholes. Senators and landlords stashed their fortunes in gold and estates, letting the middle and lower classes drown in devalued currency. You watch them retreat into their villas, dining on imported delicacies, while outside their gates beggars claw for scraps. Social resentment grew, but nothing changed. The empire had become a pyramid where the weight crushed those at the bottom. Meanwhile, trade routes faltered. Pirates, Vandal ones especially, cut off supply lines. Egyptian grain fleets dwindled. African oil, Gallic wine, Spanish minerals, all became harder to move safely. Without steady trade, Rome's cities began to starve. Urban life, once vibrant with markets and public baths, grew quieter. People fled to the countryside, where at least a small garden meant survival. Historians debate whether economic failure was the cause or the symptom of Rome's decline. Was it the invasions that wrecked trade, or the wrecked trade that left Rome too weak to repel invasions? No one agrees completely. What's certain is that by the 5th century, money had lost its magic, and with it, so had Rome's sense of stability. You picture yourself holding a coin minted under Augustus. Bright, solid, reassuring. Then you hold one from the reign of Honorius, thin, scratched, cheap. You feel not just the difference in metal, but the difference in confidence. The empire that once promised eternity now feels like a debtor's gamble, shuffling coins in the dark. And as you tuck that flimsy coin into your pouch, you can't help but wonder, if even money, the most trusted symbol of Rome's power, has crumbled, what hope does the empire itself have? You hear the clank of armor before you see the soldiers. Once, the sight of a Roman legion would have made you feel invincible, shining helmets, perfect formations, the disciplined stomp of thousands moving as one. But by the twilight of the empire, that image feels like a faded painting. The legions that built an empire are shadows of themselves, and you can sense the cracks widening. Imagine yourself standing at a frontier outpost along the Rhine. Instead of battle-hardened veterans, you see a ragtag mix of recruits. Some boys barely old enough to shave, others grizzled men dragged from farms with little training. Their armor doesn't match. Shields are dented, swords are rusting. Discipline, once Rome's signature, has frayed into improvisation. A commander shouts orders, but half the men glance at each other in confusion. You almost laugh. It looks less like the Roman war machine and more like a second-rate militia. The decay began long before. Constant civil wars drained the core legions, forcing emperors to fill the gaps with mercenaries. Federati drawn from the very tribes Rome was supposed to fear. Goths, Huns, Vandals, even Franks found themselves wearing Roman armor, fighting under Roman banners. You'd think this was clever, turning enemies into allies, but loyalty bought with coin is fragile. When payments ran late, many simply walked away, sometimes even switching sides in the middle of battle. You hear stories whispered by officers of Gothic cavalry refusing to fight unless their wives and children were given grain, of barbarian soldiers demanding land inside the empire as a form of salary. It's like hiring a security guard who occasionally breaks into your own house. Rome's borders, once fortified with pride, had become porous, manned by people with divided loyalties. Training also slipped. The legendary Roman drills, marches, formations, construction of camps were neglected. Soldiers grew soft, relying more on quick raids than on the grueling preparation that once made Rome unstoppable. Some skipped armor entirely, claiming it was too heavy. You watch one man shrug off his breastplate, saying it slows him down, and you can't help but think, the very armor that once symbolized Rome's strength has become an inconvenience. And there's the pay. The state coffers are emptying faster than wine at a festival. Soldiers are given clipped coins or promised rewards that never arrive. You picture the muttering in the camps, men huddled around fires, whispering about abandoning their posts or joining up with local raiders. Hunger and resentment erode loyalty faster than any barbarian spear. Meanwhile, the generals themselves are often more interested in politics than defense. Ambitious men march their troops into civil wars, not border battles. One year, a general is hailed as savior. The next, he's assassinated by rivals. The army becomes less about protecting the empire and more about gambling for the throne. You can almost see the emperor in Ravenna trembling, knowing his greatest danger is not a Gothic army, but his own commander's ambitions. Here's a curious detail. By the 5th century, many legions didn't even exist on paper anymore. Their names survived, Legio II Augusta, Legio XX Valeria, but the units were ghostly, barely a few hundred men where once there were thousands. Rome kept the illusion of power by keeping the names, but the reality was hollow. It's like a restaurant chain keeping the brand alive even though most locations are closed. And then comes the battlefield itself. You watch a clash between Roman troops and a Gothic warband. The Romans form up, but the line is thinner, shakier than it should be. When the Goths charge, the Roman line buckles. Some fight bravely, but others break and run. Discipline is gone, courage uneven, the result predictable. Rome no longer terrifies its enemies, it merely delays defeat. Historians argue whether Rome could have reformed its armies. Was it lack of resources, poor leadership, or just exhaustion after centuries of war? No consensus exists. What's clear is that the military decay was not sudden, but a slow withering, like a grand statue weathered down by centuries of rain. You find yourself staring at the remains of a Roman helmet in the dirt. Once polished and gleaming, now pitted and dull. It's a perfect symbol. The army that conquered the world has become brittle, hollow, and tired. And as you listen to the distant echo of boots on stone, you realize those are not the confident strides of conquest, but the weary shuffles of decline. You sit in the flickering light of a brazier, watching as another imperial envoy rushes through the palace corridors with a scroll tucked under his arm. It doesn't take long to guess the news. Somewhere on the borders, disaster has struck. Maybe Visigoths raiding in the Balkans, maybe Vandals tearing across Africa, maybe Huns pressing west. Yet the emperor's court doesn't erupt into decisive action. Instead, it freezes, everyone whispering, waiting, maneuvering. You realize the heart of Rome isn't beating strong anymore. It's stuttering. Leadership, once Rome's proudest boast, has become one of its greatest weaknesses. Think of Augustus, who could hold the entire empire together with his calm hand. Or Trajan, who marched with his legions to the edge of the known world. By comparison, the emperors of the late West seem fragile, indecisive, often little more than pawns of generals, eunuchs, or aristocrats. You feel it in the air. The throne, once the pinnacle of power, has become a chair in a dangerous game of musical chairs. Emperors rise and fall at dizzying speed. Some last only months before assassination. Others survive by clinging to the coattails of stronger men, relying on a general's army to keep them on the throne. Imagine trying to run an empire like that. It's like putting a substitute teacher in charge of a rowdy classroom, except the students are armed and plotting coups. You almost want to chuckle at the absurdity. Emperors more worried about knives in the dark than barbarian invasions at the gates. Consider Honorius, ruling in the early 5th century from Ravenna. When Rome itself was under threat, he barely stirred. Legend has it that when told Rome has perished, he thought his pet chicken named Roma had died, and only calmed down when reassured the bird was fine. Even if exaggerated, the story captures a truth. Emperors often seem detached, distracted, and oddly small compared to the crises they faced. Then there's the parade of regents, advisors, and power brokers who wielded real control. Aetius, Ricimer, Stilicho, generals who often held more sway than the emperors they served. Sometimes they defended the empire brilliantly, sometimes they pursued their own power struggles. And the emperors? They either bowed to these men or tried to eliminate them, usually with disastrous results. You can practically hear the whispers in the corridors. Who really rules Rome today? Leadership failures also extended to decision-making. When to fight, when to negotiate, when to tax, when to reform, all too often, choices were made too late or for the wrong reasons. Africa, the empire's breadbasket, was lost to the Vandals partly because of poor coordination and bad judgment. Armies were sent where they weren't needed, or pulled away from critical fronts to serve a general's ambition. The empire was like a ship with too many captains shouting conflicting orders, all while water poured in through the hull. One of the strangest truths? Some emperors were children. Literally. Valentinian III was only 6 when he came to the throne. What chance does a child have of holding back the tides of history? Behind the scenes, ambitious courtiers made decisions, each with their own agendas. It was less about saving Rome and more about saving their own power, wealth, and survival. You imagine the empire as a sick patient, surrounded by doctors who argue, experiment, or just steal the medicine for themselves. Even when strong leaders appeared, they rarely lasted long. Stilicho, perhaps the last great Roman general in the West, managed to keep the Goths at bay for decades. But paranoia and court intrigue led to his execution. With him gone, Rome was left exposed, and soon the city was sacked. You can't help but think, if Rome couldn't protect its best leaders from its own politics, how could it protect its people from invaders? Historians still debate whether Rome fell because of weak emperors or because the system itself had grown too unwieldy to manage. Was it a problem of personalities or of structure? Could a genius leader like Augustus have saved the 5th century empire, or was the decline already too far gone? The argument continues, unresolved. You listen to the hollow echo of footsteps in the imperial palace, corridors lined with fading frescoes. Once, these halls rang with decisive voices, confident strategies, and the steady hand of rulers who believed in Rome's destiny. Now, the sound is thinner, hesitant, almost apologetic. And you can't help but feel that the empire's body was strong enough to endure a while longer, but its head had lost the will to guide it. You wander through a Roman forum that feels strangely unfamiliar. The marble columns are still standing, the mosaics still glisten, but the chatter doesn't sound the same. Latin words are mixed with Gothic syllables. Christian hymns echo louder than old pagan chants, and the air feels like a world in transition. You realize it's not just armies, borders, or emperors that change the empire. It's identity itself. Rome is no longer quite sure who it is. For centuries, Romanitas, the very idea of being Roman, was like a golden badge. No matter where you came from, Gaul or Spain or Syria, to be Roman was to belong to the greatest civilization on earth. But by the late empire, that badge had grown tarnished. The old temples stood neglected, senators were fewer and less relevant, and barbarian leaders in Roman service began to wear the same titles once reserved for true-born Romans. The line between us and them blurred until no one could quite tell where Rome ended and the barbarians began. Religion, too, reshaped the cultural fabric. Christianity brought deep unity, but also friction. The old gods of Rome, once so proudly displayed on every coin and temple, were now labeled idols, their worship suppressed. You pass an abandoned shrine, the offerings scattered, replaced by a cross carved into the stone. For some, this was liberation. For others, it felt like betrayal of Rome's traditions. Entire families split between old and new beliefs, and emperors themselves often leaned so heavily into religious disputes that politics and faith became impossible to untangle. Imagine being a citizen in the 5th century, watching Gothic soldiers march down your street, serving in the imperial army, speaking in accents strange to your ears. Were they outsiders or fellow Romans? When their generals gained the consulship or married into old senatorial families, the question grew even murkier. It must have been dizzying, like living in a house where the furniture keeps rearranging itself overnight. You never quite know what room you've walked into anymore. Even language shifted. Latin endured, but the everyday speech of provinces became peppered with Germanic phrases. Gothic Bibles were read in borderlands. Folk tales carried by wandering tribes seeped into Roman taverns. The culture that once exported statues, law, and philosophy across Europe now found itself absorbing as much as it gave. It wasn't all loss, it was exchange, but it changed the empire's self-image profoundly. Art, too, reflected the transformation. Compare the elegant, realistic portraits of earlier centuries to the more abstract, symbolic figures of the late empire. Faces flattened into icons, eyes widened as if staring into eternity rather than across the Senate floor. Beauty gave way to symbolism, a sign of a culture increasingly focused on spiritual salvation rather than earthly glory. You can almost feel the mood shifting. Rome no longer painted itself as eternal conqueror, but as weary pilgrim. What's fascinating is how many Romans clung to the old myths of their greatness, even as cracks deepened. They still called their empire eternal, still imagined themselves heirs of Augustus, still sent envoys abroad to remind neighbors of Rome's prestige. But prestige works best when everyone believes in it. And by the 5th century, even Romans whispered doubts. It's like someone insisting their favorite band is still top of the charts, even though the radio stopped playing their songs years ago. The identity crisis also had political consequences. Barbarian federates demanded land within the empire not just as outsiders, but as supposed partners in the Roman world. When the Goths, Vandals, or Franks negotiated, they did so from a position of cultural legitimacy. They weren't begging Rome. They were reminding Rome that it no longer held the monopoly on civilization. And Roman officials, sometimes half barbarian themselves, often agreed. Historians argue over whether this blending of cultures should be seen as decline or transformation. Was Rome falling, or was it simply turning into medieval Europe? To some, the collapse of Roman identity meant the death of an empire. To others, it was the birth of something new, the seed of nations to come. The debate still stirs, as unresolved as the question of when Rome truly fell. As you sit under the fading fresco of a saint where once Jupiter thundered, you feel both melancholy and inevitability. Civilizations rarely die in a single moment. They dissolve, transform, and resurface in new shapes. The Western Roman Empire was no exception. Its people lived through a long twilight, unsure whether they were Romans, Christians, or barbarians, but certain that the old certainty was gone. The torches gutter lower now, shadows stretching across the stones. You sense the story winding toward its close, the last flickers of Roman light before darkness and dream take over. The identity of an empire slips like sand through your fingers, leaving behind only echoes. The candles burn low. Their wax pools across the bronze holders like rivers frozen midstream, and the air is hushed, as though the empire itself is holding its breath. You've come at last into the final century of Rome in the west, the last stretch of road before the horizon disappears into night. The 5th century is no longer a story of strength, but of struggle. The empire that once stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates has shrunk, pressed on every side. Britain is gone, abandoned to its fate. Gaul is fractured, torn between Roman generals and Frankish chieftains. Spain slips away, first to Vandals, then to Visigoths. Africa, the empire's breadbasket, its source of grain, falls to the Vandals like a candle snuffed in the dark. And with each loss, the empire's heartbeat weakens. The emperors now are shadows of their predecessors. Few command armies, fewer still command respect. Many are boys, puppets propped on the throne by generals who whisper in their ears. Names flicker by like sparks: Honorius, Valentinian, Avitus, Majorian, Anthemius. Some try bravely, even brilliantly, but the empire they inherit is too fractured, too exhausted. Majorian, perhaps the last great Roman hope, dreams of restoring the West, of building fleets and reclaiming lost provinces. But betrayal cuts him down, his reforms strangled before they can breathe. Everywhere you see generals rising above emperors. Stilicho, a man half Vandal, half Roman, fights to save Italy but is undone by envy and suspicion. Ricimer, the kingmaker, rules from behind the throne, disposing of emperors like pieces on a chessboard. By the end, the titles of emperor and general blur into futility. The purple robe becomes an empty garment, no longer commanding awe, only pity. And yet, amid the unraveling, life continues. In Rome itself, markets still open at dawn. Bakers need bread, children chase each other through streets, senators stroll gardens still trimmed by weary slaves. The city doesn't fall all at once. It drifts slowly into smaller rhythms. The grandeur fades, but ordinary lives keep flowing, as though unaware that the centuries of empire are drawing to a close. Still, you can feel the change pressing in like fog. Gothic kings carve kingdoms out of Roman land. Vandals, from their base in Carthage, send fleets that harass Italy itself. Even the walls of Rome, eternal Rome, are no longer invulnerable. Twice in this century, the city is sacked. First by Alaric and his Goths, then by the Vandals under Genseric. The old pride shatters. Rome, which once feared no enemy, now knows humiliation. Citizens who once believed themselves untouchable now whisper of survival, not glory. And yet, the empire does not collapse overnight. Its last century is like an old man's final winter, frail but not without dignity. Bishops rise to prominence, offering stability where emperors cannot. Monks retreat into silence, copying books, preserving wisdom even as armies march across fields. The empire's body weakens, but its soul prepares for transformation. You sense it, something ending, but also something waiting to be born. The last century is not a single event, but a series of small diminishings. A province lost here, a fleet burned there, a treaty signed that cedes more land to barbarian kings. The Roman name endures, but each year it means less. By the 470s, it is little more than ceremony, the echo of a greatness that no sword or treaty can restore. And yet, the empire lingers on, stubborn, like an old flame that refuses to die out. Even as the world reshapes around it, Rome clings to memory, to ritual, to the last fragile threads of its identity. You can almost imagine the empire whispering, "Not yet, not yet." The road is narrowing now, leading to the very last of Rome's emperors. Soon, the Western Empire will vanish into history, leaving behind legends, ruins, and the birth of a new world. The curtain falls not with thunder, but with a sigh. You might expect the end of the Western Roman Empire to come with some grand explosion, some final clash of steel beneath a blood-red sky. Instead, it is quieter, almost anticlimactic, like the last page of a book where the ink has begun to fade. The last emperor is a boy, his name Romulus Augustulus. The irony cannot escape you. Romulus, like the mythical founder of Rome. Augustus, like the first great emperor who ushered in centuries of power. And yet this Romulus is not a warrior or a statesman. He is perhaps 14, placed on the throne not because of greatness, but because he is convenient. His father, Orestes, is the real power, a general who sets his child as emperor because the Senate and the people still cling to ceremony. But you can almost hear history smirking at the choice of names. From first Romulus to last Romulus, the circle closes. By now, the empire is barely more than Italy itself, and even that is fraying. The legions are gone. What remains are mercenary soldiers, Germanic mostly, who serve only as long as they are paid. Orestes, trying to maintain control, denies their demands for land. The mercenaries grow restless. Their leader, Odoacer, steps forward. He is not a Roman by blood, but he commands the loyalty of the troops. In the end, loyalty outweighs lineage. In 476, Odoacer marches on Ravenna, the capital. There is no epic battle, no armies clashing for days. Orestes is captured and killed. Romulus, the boy emperor, is spared. The child is too harmless, too fragile to warrant execution. Instead, he is quietly deposed. Stripped of purple, stripped of title, he is sent into a kind of soft exile, given a pension, allowed to live out his life in obscurity. It is almost gentle, this final moment, so gentle you might miss its weight. But the Senate knows. They send the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple cloak, the symbols of power to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno. Their message is clear. We need no emperor in the West. One emperor is enough. The illusion is broken. The Roman Empire in the West is no more. And yet, the city of Rome itself still stands. Markets still open. Children still chase each other in the Forum. Priests still chant in basilicas. Life does not end, it simply changes. But the idea, the Western Empire as it once was, is gone. It is a strange ending, isn't it? Not a fiery collapse, but a quiet transition. The kind of ending you wouldn't notice if you weren't paying attention. The historians still argue, should 476 really be called the fall? After all, much that was Roman continued. Laws, language, the church, the roads, even the Senate itself lingered for a time. Some prefer to think of it not as a fall, but a transformation, a slow metamorphosis from empire to kingdoms. Still, there is symbolism in that year, in that boy's deposition. From the first Romulus to the last, from Augustus to Augustulus. A circle drawn and completed. Rome's empire in the west has gone to sleep, leaving its eastern twin to carry the name for another 1,000 years. As you listen, you can almost picture that boy, Romulus Augustulus, slipping into obscurity. Perhaps he tended a garden in his later years, watching the sun rise over fields that once fed an empire. Perhaps he lived quietly, unbothered by the weight of history. He carried one of the greatest titles the world had ever known, and then, just as easily, let it go. A small figure closing a vast story. And with that, the empire dissolves. But the tale is not over yet. Its shadows linger. Its legacy breathes on. The Middle Ages are already waiting at the door, carrying pieces of Rome into new forms, new kingdoms, new dreams. The empire is gone, yet the world does not simply vanish into dust. The morning after Rome's crown is sent to Constantinople, farmers still wake to tend their fields. Bakers still knead dough, children still scrape knees in alleyways. The fall of an empire is never a clean break. It's more like the crumbling of a wall, slow, uneven, leaving stones lying around for centuries. And you, standing amid the ruins, realize that life without an empire feels both familiar and strange. Italy itself now belongs to Odoacer. He is not a Roman emperor, but he rules from Ravenna with a kind of pragmatism. He keeps the Senate intact, keeps the laws more or less Roman, keeps the church at peace. Many citizens still think of themselves as Romans. The titles have shifted, the crowns have gone, but the old habits cling like ivy on ancient stone. You'd expect the streets to echo with despair, but instead they echo with bargaining merchants, donkey hooves, and the endless chatter of daily survival. Yet cracks spread. Without the machinery of imperial taxation, public works begin to decay. Aqueducts, once the lifeblood of cities, fall into disrepair. Roads, the very veins of Rome, start to erode. A pothole here, a broken bridge there. Small inconveniences that slowly become barriers. What once connected provinces begins to unravel. Still, the most powerful survivor is not the emperor, nor the Senate, but the church. Bishops step into the vacuum left by governors. Popes rise as moral authorities, shepherding flocks not just in faith but in politics. When famine strikes, it is priests who organize charity. When invaders threaten, it is bishops who negotiate truces. Rome, the eternal city, is no longer the center of an empire but becomes the heart of Christendom. The cross replaces the eagle as the symbol of order. Meanwhile, outside the Italian peninsula, the old provinces shift into something unrecognizable. In Gaul, the Franks grow strong, led by chieftains who will soon carve out a kingdom that carries Roman customs in one hand and tribal traditions in the other. In Hispania, the Visigoths plant roots, blending with local Roman populations to create something new. In North Africa, the Vandals, once feared pirates, hold sway over fertile lands that once fed Rome's people. You can almost hear the empire scattering like broken pottery, shards across the Mediterranean. And yet, the ghost of Rome lingers. Kings dress in Roman robes. They issue laws in Latin. They mint coins with imperial imagery, as though pretending to continue what has already ended. No one wants to admit that the empire is truly dead. The word Roman still carries weight, still grants legitimacy. Everyone wants a piece of its shadow. There is a curious truth here. Sometimes, when something so vast falls, it does not vanish, it multiplies. Instead of one empire, there are now many little Romes, each claiming to be heir to the legacy. Odoacer calls himself patrician of Italy, not emperor, but his power is real. The Franks boast of their Roman titles. Even Constantinople claims the mantle, insisting it is still Rome, alive and well, though far to the east. Historians like to draw neat lines. 476, the end of the Western Roman Empire. But if you had lived then, you might not have noticed. You would have woken up, stretched your arms, cursed the neighbor's rooster, and gone to market. The empire's fall would not have been a single moment but a long sigh, a drawn-out fading of light. And in the dimness, new fires spark, some flickering weakly, others destined to blaze for centuries. There is, of course, a sadness. Rome had once promised eternal order, a world knit together under its laws and legions. That dream is gone. In its place rises something messier, more local, more uncertain. You feel the unease in the streets, the whisper that perhaps the world is smaller now. And yet, survival continues. Humanity adapts always. And so the story does not end with Romulus Augustulus, or even with Odoacer. It continues in monasteries where monks copy crumbling texts, in warlords who carve kingdoms from Roman bones, in peasants who sow wheat where marble once gleamed. Rome is gone, but Rome is everywhere. You wander forward, through time, and the dust of Rome clings to your sandals long after the empire itself is gone. What fascinates you most is how the echoes of Rome do not fade into silence. They reverberate, carried into the Middle Ages like a lullaby that refuses to die. The ruins become seeds, and from those seeds sprout kingdoms, languages, churches, and laws that still look suspiciously Roman, even when wrapped in barbarian cloaks. Take the language, for example. Latin is everywhere, stubborn as a weed in a neglected garden. The people of Gaul mumble it until it mutates into French. In Hispania, it twists into Spanish. In the Italian hills, it softens into Italian. You hear it morph, syllables bending, sounds shifting, but always rooted in Rome. Even in the hushed chants of monks, Latin remains the tongue of prayer, binding the fractured West with a single sacred voice. The Church takes Rome's mantle with an almost theatrical flourish. Popes strut through basilicas once built by emperors, wearing vestments that feel suspiciously like imperial robes. Bishops speak with the weight of magistrates. Even the title Pontifex Maximus, once belonging to Caesar, now belongs to the head of the Christian world. The empire had fallen, but the papacy rises on its ashes, wielding influence that emperors once dreamed of. And in politics, the ghost of Rome appears again. Barbarian kings crave legitimacy, so they call themselves rex, but stamp coins in the Roman style. They surround themselves with Roman advisors, issue decrees in Latin, and pretend that their rule is simply a continuation of the old order. It's a bit like someone putting on a moth-eaten toga and hoping no one notices the holes. But people notice, and yet they play along because the word Roman still carries power. You see it most clearly in Charlemagne centuries later. When the Pope crowns him in 800, the world gasps. The Roman Empire is reborn, at least in spirit. The Holy Roman Empire, awkwardly named and even more awkwardly governed, claims to inherit Rome's authority. Voltaire would later joke that it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, but in the Middle Ages it mattered. It meant that Rome had never truly died. Even in law, Rome's fingerprints remain. The old codices, like the Theodosian Code and Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, become textbooks for medieval jurists. When medieval courts argue over property, inheritance, or punishment, they reach back to Roman principles. Imagine lawyers in 12th century Paris debating with hand gestures copied from Cicero, blissfully unaware they're channeling ghosts. And the architecture, oh, you can still feel it. Romanesque churches in the 10th and 11th centuries borrow arches and vaults straight from Rome's playbook. Roads and aqueducts, though crumbling, inspire new works. Even city planning echoes Roman grids. You walk through medieval Europe and realize you're strolling through Rome's afterimage, distorted but recognizable. Of course, not everything survives. Gladiators vanish. The toga disappears, replaced by woolen tunics and itchy cloaks. Public baths, once the pride of Roman leisure, are abandoned. Medieval folk eye them suspiciously, muttering about sin and disease. But the spirit of Rome slips into different clothes, waiting patiently. The strangest truth? Medieval people themselves never thought Rome had ended. They spoke of translatio imperii, the idea that empire passes from one hand to another, never dying, only shifting. For them, Rome was eternal, even if its capital was now Aachen or Constantinople or later, the dusty fields of the Holy Roman Empire. Historians today debate this endlessly. Did Rome truly fall, or did it simply transform? Was 476 a collapse or just a changing of the guard? You hear the arguments echoing in lecture halls. Some say it was apocalypse, others say it was evolution. But standing here, among medieval monks scratching ink on parchment, you realize the answer is both. Rome ended and Rome endured. You can almost hear the lullaby now, soft, repetitive, unending. Rome whispers through the centuries, teaching kings how to rule, priests how to pray, and peasants how to speak. The empire lives on in fragments, stitched into the quilt of medieval life. And as you settle deeper into this twilight world, you realize the empire may have fallen, but it never truly left. And so, at last, you arrive at the quiet edge of the story. The footsteps you followed for hours grow faint, and the empire itself sinks into a hush so deep you can barely tell where history ends and memory begins. Rome, it fell, yes. Armies broke its walls, barbarians sat on its throne, and its proud citizens saw their world dissolve like mist at dawn. But Rome also endured, in stone, in language, in laws, in the rhythm of daily life. Like a candle passed hand to hand, its flame flickered, sometimes dim, sometimes bright, yet never fully extinguished. You look back over the journey. The glittering forums, the soldiers at the frontiers, the farmers bent over their weary fields, the endless parade of emperors, the whispers of corruption, the thunder of invasions. All of it was Rome. All of it was human. Greatness and folly, courage and betrayal, ambition and despair. And now, in this stillness, you realize what made Rome eternal was not just its legions or its marble monuments. It was the idea, an idea that people could live together under laws, that order could stretch across nations, that power could be passed not only by the sword but by institutions, words, traditions. That idea seeped into Europe, into the Middle Ages, into modernity, and even into the world you live in now. You hear it in your own language, so many words are Roman descendants. You see it in government buildings modeled after Roman temples. You feel it in legal systems, in calendars, in the very notion of civilization. The empire never fully died because we still carry it in our minds, in our societies, in our dreams. The ruins stand silent, yet they are never truly empty. They breathe when we speak their names. They stir when we tell their stories. And here you are, tracing the long twilight of an empire, your thoughts drifting like smoke, slower and slower, softer and softer. The last thing you sense is not collapse, but continuity. Rome was mortal, like all things, yet it found a strange immortality in memory. It became not just a place, not just a time, but a shadow that lingers, a lullaby that hums beneath history's voice. And so, as your eyes grow heavy, you drift into that shadow, letting the story fade into sleep. Rome falls. Rome endures. Rome whispers. Always,